Line's good.
Never on.
Whoa.
Hard. Hardly.
Come on, Brent.
Line's good.
Got real close.
I hear high, right?
Try and hit 2/3.
Have they saved it for her? Yes, they have.
Welcome to Game of Stones, everybody. I am Sean Graham Scott, socially distancing as always. Hello, Scott.
Sean, that was a pretty subdued welcome to Game of Stones.
Yeah.
Feeling okay?
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good. Just, it felt like reining it in today.
Hey, you know what? If it's always over the top, then it's not at all over the top.
Yeah, it's got to be special when I do it.
Exactly.
So let's get right into the episode this week. We wanted to discuss the lack of diversity in curling and ways that curling can become more inclusive. We alluded to this a couple weeks ago on the show, and we've talked about it previously on the show, not in great detail, but we've talked about the lack of diversity in general across curling, and we invited some guests to have a roundtable discussion. Very pleased that Porsche Stephenson and Auria from the Wine Country Curling Club out in California. They also play in Arizona as well. They have an extensive resume playing in U.S. Nationals and mixed events. Really a strong front end pair. They play together. So we invited them on. They came on to discuss their experiences, and also Jason Chang, the skip of Team Hong Kong. He's also played in the Mixed Doubles World Championship. So we had a roundtable discussion with them earlier, and Scott, you moderated it. And what do you think people should expect if anyone's coming into this discussion, sort of before we get into it? How would you prepare somebody who's listening to this show?
I would say come in with an open mind. Think about your experiences with curling and try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's not white, who has been in their curling experiences, right? Try to think openly about what things you can do at your club to encourage minorities to come in and make them feel welcome at a club. I think we touched on a lot of that. You're not going to hear a lot of my voice because I was sort of making sure the technical stuff was working. But overall, like an open discussion about diversity in curling.
And just before we get to the discussion, if you would prefer to watch this rather than just listen to it, you can head over to our Facebook page. We did this live on Facebook, and we had some people watching live with it. And if you'd rather watch it and see us talking to each other, you can head over to the Facebook page. It's still there, available for you. Game of Stones podcast on Facebook. The video is there. So if you'd rather watch rather than listen, you can head over there. So without any further ado, we'll get right into it. Here's our roundtable with Porsche Stephenson, Auria Moore, and Jason Chang. All right, welcome everybody to our roundtable discussion this week on the podcast, talking about diversity in curling, and very excited to welcome in our guests this week. First, we'll welcome in Porsche Stephenson and Auria Moore from USA Curling, from the Wine Country Curling Club out there in California. Competitive front end. The bio that they sent us is out of date, so I won't read it. But multiple bonspiels every year, have played in women's national championships, doubles events, everything across the board. And they're joining us from California. Thanks for getting up early and joining us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And also very excited to welcome in Jason Chang, the skip of the Hong Kong men's national team. Also has played in the mixed double world championship with our friend Ling, who's local to us here in Ottawa. I've played against her. I don't know if I've ever played with Ling, but I certainly have played against her, and she has beaten the hell out of me multiple times. So,
good for her.
Jason, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Scott, Sean, and you folks in California. Nice to see you.
You too, Jason.
So we wanted to have this discussion because not only what's going on, but something that I've talked about for years. The first time I ever did a podcast about curling, I mentioned that curling doesn't represent necessarily the country I live in. Every year when Vic Router does his little essay at the end of a Brier or Scotties, he talks about how curling brings out what is the best in Canada and really is an example of what Canada is. But I look at the picture of all the teams that they show, and it doesn't look like the country that I live in every day. Certainly, in a city, it just doesn't look the same way. So I've had this internal monologue with myself about, is curling exclusionary? And we've alluded to it on the podcast before. So I wanted to have a more in-depth discussion. So to start, I want to just make sure that everyone is comfortable if we start with the baseline that curling is not a diverse sport right now. So let's start with Auria and Porsche. Is that statement out of line with your experience?
No, it's not.
It's completely in line with our experience.
Yeah.
We definitely do not see many people that look like us, whether we're traveling in our country or outside. We've done multiple seals in Canada and internationally. So just seeing that there aren't many people of color or diversity on the ice is absolutely a true statement.
Yeah. And not to mention, if we do see diversity in any of the clubs, I mean, it's on one hand. So you can probably pick out the amount of folks that you see on the ice that are people of color, that if you want to, whatever you define diversity as. But yeah, it's definitely something I've noticed in this sport, comparatively to playing basketball, running track. Porsche's done sports obviously also. And, you see a really different groups of people, diverse groups of people, everyone interacting. But with curling, you go out on the ice and you look around and you look like you, and that's really it. And you're like, hi, you stand out. Yes, the moment you walk into the room, the music stops. Hello, everyone. Even if folks don't necessarily know anything about us or know what curling club we're from, or if we curl at all, the moment we walk into a curling club, it's like, oh, those are two Black girls. And it's a unique experience. We get the same thing when we get onto the ice. Sean, we've discussed previously some of the statements that were made in essence, and they're absolutely true because of that. I think naturally when people see others that don't look like them, there's a little bit of hesitation, maybe some question, maybe even some awkward feeling, maybe some discomfort. I think that's anyone. If we had a group of redheads in here and then all of a sudden a blonde came in, you're like, oh, blonde. So I think it's not necessarily just the color. I think it's really just seeing different looking people that are coming into the curling community that are fresh faces that people haven't seen before.
Different stands out.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. And Jason, does that fall in line with your experiences as well?
Yeah, Sean. I mean, I completely agree that the diversity is an issue in the sport. It's not just to be inclusive of all communities in Canada and in their case in the US, but it's also hurting the growth of the sport too, right? Which is really important. Look, you talked about Vic Router's little essay monologue at the end of the Brier at the Scotties, and you're absolutely right. They show the different teams' pictures, and you see the group picture, and they all look very similar, those people. And you're absolutely right. It doesn't reflect the diversity of the country that we are. I think there's been some improvement. There's a little bit more diversity at my curling club and the curling clubs I see in the Toronto area since I started curling in Toronto. But it hasn't really made any leaps and bounds of improvement. I remember when I first started playing on the Ontario Curling Tour back in the day, and I was really often the only one who was not, if it was a men's bonspiel, the white male on the ice. I was usually the only one. Sometimes there was one other person, but we were the token diversity, individuals in those bonspiels for a long, long time, right?
Yeah, and the first time I brought this up at a curling club too, I said, it's everyone looks the same, and somebody said to me, "Well, what about Jim?" and Jim was the one black member of the club. And I thought, well, the fact that you're like that's the definition of tokenism, when you could say,
Right,
well,
right.
the one, right? Like that's part of the problem.
Hey.
Yeah, it really does stand out. And so I'm curious, because it's not a diverse sport, the three of you have competed at very high levels within the sport, but it's also a sport that a lot of people get into usually from family connections, and certainly when you watch on TV, like with other sports, you want to get involved and test it out. So I'm curious as to how each of you got involved in curling and where the interest was generated, given that it's hard to find people who look like you to look up to when you're watching on TV.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess throw that. I should be more direct. We'll throw that to California first.
Yeah, well, our situation was a little unique because I am a Beatles fan, a huge Beatles fan, probably I love the Beatles.
Fanatic.
Yes, thank you. Understatement for sure. I love the Beatles. So we were watching a movie one day, Help, and there's a scene where John and George are curling. And I told Porsche, I said, I know that this is a huge sport in Canada, but it's never like on TV in the US. I wonder if they do this here. And just on a fluke, it was like a Saturday afternoon, she Googled it and she saw that Wine Country Curling Club, which is like 20 minutes from our house, was hosting a Learn to Curl at like 7:30 in the morning the next day. And she was like, well, we could sign up. I think it's $25. And I'm like, do you want to do this? And she's like, yeah, I'll do it with you. I'm like, all right, we're down, let's go. And we went the next day, short sleeves, no gloves, hair completely pulled back, freezing cold, had no idea what to expect. We're like, oh, okay, like, we're going to go out there for like 5 minutes, throw some stones. And then the moment we got out there, we're like, okay, so this is a real sport. And people are taking this very, very seriously. And we got out there and we loved it. They were Wine Country Curling Club, Bob Poole, Katie Feldman, which was the prior president and now the current president, Katie, were really just welcoming to us. They opened arms for us. They said, if this is a sport that you're interested in, here are the next set of days for you to come back. We offer coaching here. And the president had said, if you guys really want to learn, you can join my team and I'll teach you the ropes. And we were hooked. And the next thing you know, we signed up for a Bonspiel a month later, got a taste of what winning was like because we made it to semifinals. And we were like, we're going, we're sticking with this. We like this. Here it goes. And that's kind of our intro story.
We started curling from the Beatles movie Help. How ironic.
That might be the only origin story for any competitive curler ever, the Beatles movie.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the Beatles inspired our interest, but the fact that Wine Country was welcoming of us at the time was really what made, I think, it easy for us to be competitive and to want to continue. Though we definitely got some stares that first day and people were wondering if we were in the right place, so to speak. There were a couple of people, like Auria mentioned, that were really welcoming and friendly to us. And I think by the end of that first practice, I almost had a full tuck.
Yeah.
So.
Porsche had a natural tuck. I was the one who was starting. I feel like that's still the story of our life, but she just had it naturally. And I'm like, all right, I can't look like crap here next to her. Let me try to get this together. And then by the time we did that first Bonspiel, we met Jerome Larson and he just changed our world. He was like, who are these girls that want to curl? Come here. Opened his arms and just hugged us and was like, you girls keep your eyes set on the Olympics and go for it. And that's really been it. That's been our history. And now here we are 5 years later. Yeah, 5 years.
Jason, what about you? What's your origin story in the sport?
Yeah, it's not as exciting as Auria and Porsche's, but there is a little bit of connection between me and more and Porsche because I also throw tuck. So congratulations for being able to throw tuck as a natural. I was born in Hong Kong, and And as you may imagine, there's no curling in Hong Kong. There's still very little curling in Hong Kong. We started developing some curling in Hong Kong now, but certainly when I was young, there was no curling in Hong Kong. We immigrated to Canada, to Calgary specifically, and I think I just like Scott, I like watching TV. So I would watch anything that was on TV. And, CBC would have all sorts of sports on, including curling and weightlifting and diving and, all sorts of weird things. And I really gravitated to curling. I just loved watching it. But it actually took me a long time to get into a curling club. As you mentioned, a lot of people get into the curling club because they know someone or have a family member who curls. And this is what perpetuates the fact that the curling clubs look the same, right, year after year, because the same people bring similar looking people into the club to curl. It didn't take me until really, I only seriously started curling when I got to university. I moved to Toronto for university, wanted to find some new activities to do. And U of T had a group of, there was a U of T curling club. Basically, it was a group of curlers who curled out of East York Curling Club, where I still curl today. They helped form the teams. We play in the leagues of East York. There's no a specific time slot, but they helped form the teams for us into the mixed and the women's and the men's leagues, etc. So that's how I first seriously got into curling. I loved watching it. I never went to a curling rink because I didn't even know where they were in Calgary. Actually, I never knew where any curling rink was in Calgary until partway through university when I went home. I was driving down one of the roads and I noticed the curling club for the very first time, probably 15 years after I started curling or started watching curling.
Wow.
Now, Auria and Porsche mentioned that their initial welcome was very positive. Did you have the same experience, Jason, where you went to the club, you started to participate? Was it a welcoming experience for you when you first went?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was very welcoming for two reasons. One is because there was the U of T curling club. There were a lot of students who were curling. I think at its height, and we don't have this relationship with U of T anymore per se, but at the time there were about 30, even 35 U of T curlers curling at East York Curling Club. And so I went to their open house. Basically, the East York Curling Club gave U of T an open house time slot to recruit students to join the club. So there were probably 50 or 60 students there at that open house. And the instructors who were U of T students who were helping us learn to curl, I knew a little bit about curling already, but they were helping all those who had never seen or heard about curling or watched curling or played curling before. They were certainly very welcoming. There were a few club members there as well. I remember the club manager was there as well. And then they convinced me to join in a league. That's how it started for me. And when I joined the league, it took me a while. There's a few steps to a new curler, right? One, you're just trying to learn how to curl, and then you join into a league, and you're just trying to figure out how to play the game. At some point, you try to play in a bonspiel, right? And for a lot of curlers, there's a bit of a leap to doing that too, right? And I think clubs and leagues need to do more to encourage their new curlers to participate in those types of activities, right? To get into that curling culture where the bonspiels and the interaction and the fun afterwards outside of curling too. But I had played in my first bonspiel, not in my first season, but maybe my second or third season. And the team that I got put with, they were so encouraging. They actually were the ones who encouraged me to get my first pair of curling shoes. They were like, "You're a good curler. You should get curling shoes. They'll make you so much better," right? So I did. The next season, I got curling shoes from that. So for me, it was a very welcoming experience. But what I saw, though, was there wasn't really, other than the outreach through the U of T program, there wasn't that outreach to the wider community for the diversity, right? We've gotten some benefit from that U of T program because university students were quite diverse in that group. But I don't think curling clubs have done enough to proactively outreach to different communities. And I think, some communities have, taken up curling more than others. And it maybe depends on where you live, right? Certainly at my club at East York, we do have, a good number of Asian curlers who curl there. And we're not necessarily in an Asian hotbed in East York by any means, but we certainly haven't reached out to, as well to, for example, the Black community or the South Asian community, right? So there are so many pockets of groups that I think curling clubs can and should be reaching out to, not just to increase diversity at the club and to make it reflective of, in our case, of Canada and Toronto, but for the survival of curling clubs, right, in the long term.
Yeah, especially in a city like Toronto where we've seen, how many clubs have closed, Jason? It's at least 2, right?
Oh, quite a few, right? Well, probably two in very recent memory. So St. George's Golf and Country Club, this was their very final season of curling. And most of the closures of curling facilities have been with the country clubs, I would say, in the GTA. Weston Golf and Country Club ended their curling program a couple of years ago. And if you go back further in history, there were others, right? So we've lost clubs. We've gained a couple in the GTA. The King Curling Club is one that came online within the last 10 years, I believe. And I know there's been some extra sheets added, for example, in Newmarket at the York Curling Club, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. But there really hasn't been more ice that compensates for the loss of ice, right? Now, I think part of the reason is the country club is even more exclusive and people looking the same than even a regular curling facility or curling center. So I think that's where some of the additional challenges are with the golf and country clubs. They haven't been expanding their membership base, among other potential issues. There is a movement right now in the GTA to build a new curling facility in the west end of Toronto. There is currently, with the closing of St. George's, there is now officially no curling facility on the west side of Toronto proper. So there is a West End curling committee that is trying to lobby the city to build a new facility or repurpose an existing facility for curling, for dedicated curling. And that process is going through study and review from Parks, Forestry, and Recreation here. But one of the key issues, though, that the city's interested in is, will the facility be full, and will diverse people be using the facility? Different age groups, different people of different racial backgrounds, et cetera, right? That's a key part of when a city is evaluating whether they should build a new recreation facility. Is it inclusive for lots of people?
Yeah, and certainly in a city like Toronto, certainly the most diverse city in the country, it needs to be a diverse membership to survive and to be successful. It's sort of part of what it should be. But I'm curious, Auria and Porsche, that Jason mentioned that he had that good first experience and then got on a team and had a positive experience. What was that transition like for you from the learn to curl? You mentioned you met Jerome, but getting placed on a team and based on the bios, have you two ever played separately, like on different teams, or has it always been together?
We've always played together.
Okay.
We've had some recommendations from different curlers to play separately, and we've been pretty firm in our beliefs on sticking together. We know how we play. We understand each other. We're a dynamic duo, so we haven't wanted to. But that transition for us came pretty quickly, I'd say. That first experience that I mentioned, our first Bonspiel where we had met Jerome, that really just excited us, put us on our high horse. We're like, all right, the unicorn is there. We're chasing after it. And then we started noticing going to try to get practice ice, trying to team with other women to play with competitively, trying to get mentors, trying to get coaches were all very challenging for us. And I don't believe that we would have had that same challenge if we would have looked differently. Do you want to add to that?
And I'll say that some of the anxiety, maybe even in wanting to play separately or even explore something like that, is knowing the experience that we've had together and how we've kind of been treated differently or outcasted, I'll say, when it comes to team dynamics or trying to find a consistent team. I think finding a good team that anyone works well with, especially in this sport, is super imperative to your success. And having someone that you can practice with consistently, like Auria mentioned, knowing the way that your other teammates perform or when they're underperforming, so you know how to compensate. All of those team dynamics are super important to grow and I think foster with a group of 4 people that you work with consistently. And at first, we initially had thought that perhaps some of the women that we wanted to work with, that we were super interested in, or maybe that we thought might be interested in us, were busy with their schedules, different goals as far as competitiveness is concerned, or commitments. But after a while, we started to see that a lot of those same folks partnered with people that looked more like them rather than us. And after going through that for multiple years, it starts to feel as though it's not necessarily just because people are busy or that time commitments are an issue. It's more so about the level of comfort, whether people want to address that or blatantly say it or not. It is very obvious that it's more difficult to partner at times with people that don't look like you rather than to stay with what you know, as you mentioned, maybe curling with your family or friends that you've grown up with forever. So there's absolutely a risk there that we feel like certain people don't want to take, and that's okay. Would it make us more comfortable if we saw other people that were more diverse in our sport? Absolutely. But for now, we just work on what we can work on, which is remaining a consistent front end and doing doubles events that are open when we're allowed to.
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of time in Canada before the pandemic happened. We were going back and forth to Canada almost every month, doing different bond spills there, because Canada has a lot of really great open doubles spills. And we don't see a lot of that in the States. We see a lot of mixed doubles, but we don't see open doubles. And that's given us an opportunity to really just play and not have to worry about finding all the other stuff that comes with it. We just want to play. I think when we started traveling more, we started seeing some consistency around some snares, a little chatter. You go into locker rooms, and of course, you go into locker rooms and people come in, everyone stops talking because if they're strategizing, but you notice when people stop talking immediately when you walk past them, or it's they think they're just going to take over our sport. Or, you just hear little side comments. Who do they think they are? And we were hearing these comments when we just started buying practice ice. We would go and literally have like $5 Target shirts that were V-necks that were the same color. And people would say, oh, who do they think they are? They're trying to look all matchy-matchy. We even had girls that were like, oh, you twins? Are you guys sisters? They automatically assume that we're related. They automatically assume that we're sisters because we're two Black people that are curling together. And I understand that there's a lot of, brotherly love and sisterly love that happens in the sport. We see lots of, siblings that are teammates, but we're not related. But that's the first thing that folks think. And so it's challenging when we were starting off and going through that transition to see how people were responding to us and then always having to react. And it's made us grown into the folks that we are today. And it's one of the reasons why we continue playing together. We'll never separate.
Sean, you mentioned, and just to kind of wrap up this final thought here, you mentioned before seeing a portion of our Essence article where we discussed maybe people not wanting to shake our hands or do the typical good curling, that's so welcomed in the sport that everyone's accustomed to. And I won't call out the curling club and the spiel that we were at, but I'll just say our first experience in Canada that we had playing internationally and representing the U.S., we were very excited. We went to a club that we didn't know much about, but we were willing to go because we had seen that there were a bunch of international players there. And though we weren't very seasoned in our careers, we thought it was going to be
at all
a great learning opportunity for us to lose with pride, if nothing else, and some great connections, maybe meet some other women who were like-minded that we could form some connections with. And upon arrival, when we had gotten there, our first game, we were introduced to the other team, and we noticed that they didn't want to shake our hands. I think maybe one of the women didn't take her glove off, and she had shook our hand, but the rest of the team had just went on into their practice. And we had thought initially that was sort of a routine because we didn't know international competitive play. So we thought maybe silly us from the States, good curling is just like a arena sport or more of like a casual handshake that you do. But when it comes down to being competitive, maybe you don't shake hands. It wasn't until the second game that we had that we saw that same team take off their gloves and shake everyone's hands.
Yeah.
And so that really just like took us back a bit and rubbed us the wrong way. We didn't understand why. We had continued to get snares and snickers throughout the rest of the tournament. And mind you, we were losing pretty terribly at that time.
You know, we were so new.
We weren't some big threat, but just the fact, I think, that we had shown up to a club that didn't expect to have us, looking differently and being so lively and ready to compete or make connections was off-putting to some people. And that's something that has stuck with us ever since. We wish that that wasn't the case.
We've seen
Porsche, that's
so much about
sorry, I just want to say that's what must have been such a, terrible first impression, right? You got not only of playing in a competitive bonspiel, but of Canada maybe, right?
Right.
Canada. So as a typical Canadian or a Hong Kong Canadian, I'd like to apologize on behalf of all of Canada for what you experienced in that situation. Certainly, it's and this reminds me of something, at my work, I work for the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and one of the initiatives we have is about making businesses understand the importance of diversity and inclusion in their workforce, and in particular, in our case, our project relates to persons with disabilities. But one of the things I read or heard recently on social media is it's not just about the diversity. It's not just about getting the individual in the competition at the curling club, but inclusion is what's matter, right? It's not just inviting someone to the party, it's asking them if they want to dance, or in your case, shaking your hand and including you in part of the competition as you should be.
Treating people equally, the same, including people equally.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of that might be the worst curling story I've ever heard, that people refuse to shake your hand. Like that's
we have more
awful.
I mean, Porsche has fallen on the ice at an event that we won't even say the name, but she fell pretty hard, enough to where her entire tailbone and spine all the way up was black bruised. And when she fell on the ice, not a single person asked if she was okay. Not a single person asked if she needed help to get up. As a matter of fact, the other team, the gentleman, laughed, walked right past her, and we continued playing. So that's just one of many, and that was in the U.S. That was
in the U.S.
So that was at an event that we have not repeated.
A large championship event.
Yeah. I'm curious to ask too. You mentioned the difficulty in finding teams and staying with teams. I'm curious how much of the American context, particularly the California context, matters in this, just in the size of the curling community there. And have you noticed, as you've traveled around, differences based on the size of the curling community? So, if you take, when you come up here, there's more curlers in Canada, certainly, than there are in California. Is there a difference based on how many people are members of a club or at a bonspiel, or is it just sort of the curling culture is the curling culture?
I think the culture is really the culture. In California, I know especially in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Southern California, there has been more of an effort to try to attract different groups of people because of the area that the curling clubs are in. In Oakland and in San Jose, Hollywood Curling Club. But that is very exclusive, I feel, to California. Because of the culture and the diversity or acceptance that is I would say culturally a big part of what California is. Moving towards the East Coast, it's very much so the typical culture that you guys are referring to in Canada, where the only people that you really see curling there are people who have been curling for years. You don't necessarily meet a curler that hasn't been on the ice since they were age 6. And if you come to their home club or you're practicing there, then they're very taken back that you're interested or that you're curling, because this is a family and almost a historic thing for a lot of people. They feel as though this is ingrained in their family traditions, and newcomers aren't necessarily as welcome as we would like for them to be. So we like to infiltrate and show up to those spiels anyways, especially when we see that there are some longstanding spills that haven't seen any diversity. I think it's fun to go to those areas and see if we're received or not received, so to speak.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, at least to enjoy the history of whatever curling club that we're at has to offer, because we truly do enjoy the sport. I mean, just like any other curler, we're watching old Olympics, old Briars, old YouTube footage. We're reading Russ Howard books and all of the resources that going to camps. We're doing all the typical things that you would expect a curler to do. So when we go to these places, as we mentioned, whether we're welcome or not, we make sure to enjoy as much of the history and culture as we can.
Jason, have you had any experiences, if I may, sort of Auria and Porsche are talking about basically being othered, if I could sort of put it in those terms, in these events, like, by members, sort of clearly distinguishing this otherness that, that's me pulling in my historian mind for a second. And Jason, have you had similar experiences? Particularly, I wonder, in the context over the past few months, so many videos of anti-Asian racism in the midst of the pandemic, certainly that's been going on. And I've only watched the ones in Canada. I'm sure there's tons in the United States as well. But have you had similar situations where you have felt or been placed as an other within a club? And particularly, I wonder if that accelerated since you started to represent Hong Kong internationally.
From a curling club perspective or within the curling community, I haven't had overt experience that Auria and Porsche have experienced, right? So I've been fortunate that I haven't experienced anything overtly like that. I do know that, oftentimes, and this happens, for me, it's happened less and less now than it did when I first started curling. I used to get pointed out that, hey, there's an Asian guy curling, right? I don't get that as much anymore. And I certainly haven't had any hostility in terms of, or at least overt or open hostility in terms of the fact that I play for Hong Kong. But in terms of just racism in general, I certainly still experience some racism on the streets of Toronto. I just a few months back, I experienced racism right before all this shutdown happened riding on a TTC streetcar. So racism is there. Whether it's overt or not, we can't deny that racism is there. We've got to find solutions to root it out and get to the root of the problem. I've been fortunate, like I said, that I haven't experienced that overtly within a curling club. But for us to say that, Canada is better than the US in terms of race relations, I think a lot of us who are not the stereotypical Canadian, right, will say that, yes, we have experienced racism in our society, whether it was through sport or just in general in society. Yeah,
and I mean, we had a prime minister who in the 2015 election talked about old stock Canadians. Like that's a literal phrase that came out of the prime minister's mouth. And I shouldn't get too political, but I mean, come on, like it was 2015. Give me a break. Like that kind of stuff. And we even have one of the conservative leadership candidates right now talks about taking back Canada. He literally put out an ad that said, "Let's take back Canada." And that's the sort of language that it's not even a dog whistle anymore. It's just like, it's just they're outright saying it. And it's part of, us versus them. And I mean, obviously it's wrong and it's terrible, but it doesn't do anything to address any of the systemic issues that are in place. And certainly in this country, there was another killing of an Indigenous person by the RCMP on Friday out in New Brunswick, which is, again, part of a systematic problem that takes place, that exists in policing there. And so it's not surprising then to me that this filters into curling clubs or is part of the curling culture, that the systemic racism that we see outside exists inside as well. I'm curious though, Jason, just to follow up on that, is when you're, say, at the Pacific Asia Championships, where there obviously are more people from the region and more people who are sort of look the same, look more like you. Do you notice a difference on the ice? Does the vibe of the event change? Do you feel more comfortable? I'm just kind of curious, when there are more people, when you have an experience like me, where I look around and saw white people, if you have an experience similar, when you look around, it's people who look like you. Does that change the experience for you at all?
It definitely feels different, right? So even when I step into a room, and if that room, and I'm the only Asian person in there, you kind of feel like you're the only one Asian person in there. And similarly, I'm sure if there was a room of Asians and Porsche stepped in our room, she might feel like she's the only one there. So certainly from a competition perspective, when I play in competition series, you're right. I do look different from everybody else in the room. Whereas the Asia Pacific Championships is, now that we have Africa in our zone and they're playing with Team Nigeria, are actually the Pacific Asia group photo actually looks kind of like Canada. You've got Asians, you've got your blacks individuals, you've got those from the Australia, New Zealand, right? And if we ever get India to start up their team, it will actually really look like Canada a lot more. What's interesting at the Pacific Asia is and this is part of this is due to the nature of the sport and how there are some of the nations who are laser focused on winning medals and getting to the Olympics. And that would be actually the other, Asia countries like Korea, China, and Japan. And then the rest of the field, which isn't as well funded, obviously not full-time athletes like Chinese Taipei, ourselves, Nigeria, Australia, New Zealand. There is a bit of I don't want to say it's a rift, but there's certainly different groups of who's interacting with who, right? So for us as Team Hong Kong, we tend to interact a lot with Team Nigeria and New Zealand and Australia and Taipei and Kazakhstan because we're not the professional teams, with lots of national funding with the sole purpose of winning a world championship medal or getting to the Olympics, right? So, so for us, we're kind of isolated actually from our, the folks that maybe look more like me, the teams from China. We actually don't interact with them all that much because of just the nature of our sport and where it's gotten to, and the focus on Olympic medals for those particular nations.
Oh, that's really interesting. Auria and Porsche, have you noticed a similar thing where people who are at the same competitive level as you do have a better experience with them versus more competitive or less competitive? Have you had a similar experience in that regard?
I think immediately to our Arena 2018 championships, we placed bronze there, and I believe there were 2 other women that were of color. And it was so interesting when we had seen each other because typically you don't see other people of color, whether that is from a Hispanic background, African-American, etc., at that championship level. So when we had ran into each other for the first time in 2018, we all got together and had a laugh.
Hi, you're here. Good to see you.
And there was this level of understanding where rather than us individually and the other person, the other 2 people had also acknowledged this thought, rather than focusing on the color of our skin and being so outliered with our performance, we could relax and just focus on the sport. So I don't know if necessarily Jason feels the same way, but sometimes when you're in a room with other people that look like you, it makes you feel more comfortable, where you don't necessarily feel the pressure of 1, having to perform at a high level, but 2, having to perform at a high level because you're expected to as the outlier and everyone's watching you. So there is a level of comfort there.
Yeah, and maybe it's not even that they're expecting you to perform, but they're paying attention to how you're going to perform, right? They're watching. Are they good, right? They don't look like real curlers, right? Are they actually good, or are they,
Right.
And obviously you guys have proven yourselves with your success that you've had, but why should somebody ask that question just because of the way they look, right? They should expect that everybody's there to compete and judge them on the merits of how they've done.
Right. We just want to focus on the sport always. And we know that, unfortunately, the way that we look sometimes distracts from that. So absolutely, when you have other people in the room that mirror or mimic that same look, it makes you feel as though you're not the sole outlier or distraction per se.
Have you had any barriers in terms of coaching or even from USA Curling, even if not sort of directly or explicitly, in terms of finding funding, helping find team members, support at that level in your experience as you've gone through the sport?
I don't think funding has never been a challenge for us. Our main focus has always been getting mentorship / coaching to help develop us to the level that we want to be at. And then finding like-minded, teammates that want to get on the ice with us. It's absolutely been a challenge for us and a barrier that we've still yet to break. I think there's, back to looking different, I think there's some intimidation, I'd say, there in even being welcomed. I know a couple years ago, like you say, now there's a lot of excitement, a lot of, attention on what's happening, protests and racism. This is something that the Black community experiences like every year. There's always a protest about police brutality that's happening. And what stands out to mind is when we first started curling, there were a few names that we were told that you need to know. If you want to be a successful curler in the US, there are certain names that you need to know. And one of them was Phil Drobnik. And a few years ago, I remember, I believe it was the Philando Castile shooting that took place in Minnesota, that in response to that, he tweeted out a quote of Archie Bunker. And I was like, whoa, I understand that, like, we all have different political views. That's fine. I don't care about that. I understand we all may have different views of us as people. I don't care about that either. But what I do care about is when it affects me and my ability to move forward or to get any progression in a sport that we have dedicated our lives to. And so if we see comments like that coming from those that head the departments that make or break our curling careers, it doesn't feel like we have any chance of being welcomed.
And it's not necessarily to single out one person alone, because there are other people in leadership.
Just one example.
But
just one example.
Definitely from a professional and a competitive place, it is difficult to seek out mentorship or to ask for mentorship when you know that people that are so influential within that group feel a certain way or feel comfortable enough to express their personal opinions in a professional setting. And I don't know necessarily how things operate with mentorship in staff in other countries, especially in Canada. But I know here in the US with other groups and other sports, coaching staff and mentorship for basketball, let's say the NBA or the WNBA, those kind of political comments or political personal values and opinions aren't really expressed because the sport that you're in is diversified, and you know that that's something that wouldn't be welcomed. Here in curling, because we're not diversified, it seems as though people are more comfortable to say some of those personal things that wouldn't be said in other sports. They wouldn't be accepted.
And so when you see things like that, it's like, how can you say, okay, well, I know that this person feels this way. Now, how am I going to ask them for mentorship? How am I going to ask them for coaching? How am I going to say, hey, do you know 2 people anywhere in the country that would like to team with us so we could go do some events together? When you know that they have, and that's not singling out, like Porsche said, one individual, that's just in the general sense. If people feel that way about you or your voice or what you stand for, how are you ever able to progress with them or leverage them as a resource in this sport? So I think it's something that we've seen here in the US. In Canada, to be honest with you, we haven't really had that problem with mentorship. Russ Howard was awesome. He's opened his door to us. Any questions we've had his camp. Even Adam Kingsbury was very nice. We've reached out to a lot of different coaches that are in Canada that have given us great responses, and we appreciate their feedback. We just haven't really had that same response from USA Curling, particularly the HPP program.
Well, Auria, I'm really jealous because I've never met Russ Howard, but he is my curling idol, actually.
Yeah.
He is my curling idol. So
He's the man.
We
You
just
gotta
saw
sign
him
for his camp.
in October. He had a great little camp in October out
Yeah.
here. He loves to come to Arizona.
Yeah.
Well, sure. He lives on the East Coast. Why would he not love to go to Arizona in the winter? Come on. Yeah. I just want to say, 'cause Scott, I don't know how many people might be watching, but if anybody has questions on the live stream, they feel free to ask them and ask our guests. And Scott is moderating that and keeping an eye on that if anybody wants to ask questions. And Scott, just hop in whenever there is one. But I do want to get back to this issue or this question of coaching for Jason. You know, you and Ling have established and really been spearheading the Hong Kong curling program, but you've been doing it from Canada. So how has your experience been? I know Rick is, I believe he's the official team coach for Hong Kong. That's Ling's husband, for anybody who doesn't know. But what has the experience been for you in trying to get that program going in terms of coaching, funding, that kind of thing?
yeah, and so by no means should me or Ling take all the credit, or me or Ling or Ring take all the credit. But I think there's kind of a two-pronged approach that we have, right? With the lack of dedicated ice in Hong Kong, and there is some arena ice. And this only started maybe a couple years ago, a year or two ago. We got this up and going at in a mall, in a skating rink or a hockey rink at Festival Walk. They have one session Monday, I believe it's in the evenings or it's in the mornings, can't remember which. They have like a 2-hour block. They've got one set of stones and they're getting another set of stones. Actually, I think they just got their second set of real curling stones in there. So that's accommodating more people to come in and try it. Obviously, getting the word out is hard, and winter sports in a subtropical, climate and location is tough. It's a tough sell, right? But that is happening. So in Hong Kong, they're trying to get people interested, trying it out, and for those who want to, who want to pursue more and to improve their skills, they're trying to identify some athletes in Hong Kong who might have the talent and skills to keep going and maybe eventually be able to represent Hong Kong in bond steels, etc. In Canada, what we try to do is to bring those players who are on the national team for the different disciplines, the women, the men's, the mix, over to Canada at least once a year to do training on dedicated curling ice, because that's important, with a curling coach that has, in Rick, that has his curling certifications quite a high level and done a lot of coaching and teaching of the sport. So yeah, Rick is, I don't think there's any official names or positions that we use, but you can nominally think of him as the national coach for the Hong Kong curling program. And then for my men's team, because the men's and women's play Pacifics at the same time, it's impossible for Rick to be coaching both teams simultaneously. It's very, very difficult. He would not be sleeping at all. So we sometimes have been able to bring in kind of a part-time coach. But that's tough. Without the funding, you can't pay for them to come there. So when we've been able to do it, we've only been able to bring them in for a few days to give Rick a bit of a break. But that's tough, because even when our part-time coach leaves, Rick is still only able to probably come to the men's games half the time. Better than nothing, but again, that's where funding and the lack of the coaches that we have at our disposal as well. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach in terms of coaching and grooming Hong Kong curlers. The stuff that's happening in Hong Kong, kind of at the initial stage, right? The getting them interested, identifying some talent, and then at the actual serious coaching stage of trying to bring them over to Canada, or in some cases, I know Ling has gone over to Asia and they practiced and participated at Bonspiel in Japan. So, but the key is to get the training on dedicated curling ice, because as you know, arena ice or non-dedicated ice is completely different than curling club ice. And even that, curling club ice is different than competition curling ice.
Oh yeah.
As you know, so.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Auria and Porsche, you seem to very much agree with the ice part of that statement.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely. Championship ice is different than dedicated ice, and dedicated ice is much different than arena ice. We had a spiel in Southern California a few years back, and their humidifier had broken. And so there were these little drips that were coming down from the ceiling, creating moguls, little stalagmites on the ice. And we still wanted to play because it was a fun bond spiel. It wasn't serious. And we were chucking those rocks down and they were skipping.
We were very serious. It had been a serious spiel. We were very serious and we showed up to play. Regardless, moguls or whatever it was, we were still playing. But yeah, we definitely noticed a difference. And then we, in the Bay Area, we've shared ice with the San Jose Sharks. So as you can imagine, it's really fun to try and throw a stone right in the middle of a
hockey stuff that diverts.
Yeah, I think it'd be a lot easier. Yeah, it'd be one thing to get on the ice after, you know, a 5-year-old team practices, but after a professional team, like they're tearing that ice up a lot more. That'd be really hard.
Oh yeah, and we've got the professional, like the kid skaters, and they're just sitting there doing their little spins and twirling, and we're like, no, you're hitting ice. Throw a stone on that.
You know, rumor has it though that Wine Country Curling Club has some of the best ice, arena ice in the country. So
that's right.
Any of your listeners out there, if you ever come to California, Wine Country's the club to go to.
Yeah, we actually have don't quote me, but I feel like we have maybe 7 or 8 curling clubs total now in the state of California. Wow. So California has grown quite a bit in curling, and I know San Francisco Bay Area Curling Club has been full force in their effort in trying to get dedicated ice for the last few years, and they're putting a dedicated ice facility in a very diverse area in Oakland. So I would expect to walk into that curling club and see some of the diversity that we're all hoping for. Because of location alone, you know,
time will tell.
Right.
I wonder if, or how much, I don't know if it's necessarily appropriate, but the idea too of competitiveness, certainly in Canada, there's a lot of discussion about ensuring that the best team represents us at the World Championships and then most importantly at the Olympics so that the country can continue to win. And certainly the United States has reformed its programs in terms of how Olympic teams are selected. But one thing that never comes up is that if the sport is exclusionary or not welcoming, that large swaths of the population would never be in line or considered to represent the country. So if we're trying to build the most competitive programs we can, we should want to draw from the largest pool of people possible. And, you know, in this country, I don't know what the breakdowns are, but certainly not all 38 million people or 40 million, whatever our population is now, are being welcomed into curling clubs. So that strikes me as something that should be included in the discussion at the Curling Canada level of ensuring that Canada has a competitive program and continues to compete at the highest level and is the favorite. So, you know, for Auria and Porsche, I'll start with you. Has that ever come up with USA Curling, like trying to draw in just, you know, widen the participation, reach out to groups that traditionally aren't at curling clubs, just from a purely competitive standpoint, to just broaden the base from which USA Curling can draw?
I think with USA Curling, that's a much bigger question. It's not even necessarily around diversity. It's about including those that aren't generational curlers, to be honest with you.
It's a very generational
that's
program.
That's the first, I'd say, barrier for us as curlers is trying to work with the HPP folks, learning that a lot of the curlers that they've known for a long time, or they have been curling for a long time. And so there isn't really a lot of room for additional competitive teams. So I'd say that's probably the first thing. It's just like any other big sport. It's like, look at lacrosse, you know, look at NASCAR. You don't see much diversity in those sports either. That's because, honestly, some of those sports have made it very clear, not welcomed. So if that's the case with curling, I think it starts with the generational gap first and wanting to include new curlers, new faces. And then I think the second piece is we're willing to, target those that are diverse groups that don't look like some of the curlers that we've traditionally had. I think it's a combination of sorts.
As it stands currently for the program as we know it here in the U.S., as Auria mentioned, with the generational piece, the high performance program focuses a lot of their attention on the junior curlers that are then fostered into the adult high performance program. I believe the majority of the adult members of the high performance program have been pulled from the juniors group that has already been a part very much so of USA Curling and the junior HPP program. So these children are then groomed to become adult members of a program that other functioning or competitive adults or children maybe that have not had the opportunity to be a part of that program are automatically excluded out of. And that was something that was a really large barrier and continues to be a large barrier for us. One, because we have aged out of what they would consider that program. We're nowhere near junior curlers. And two, knowing that as adult women, if we are, as we had mentioned, looking for coaching staff, resources, or an opportunity to gain acceptance into that program, there is only, I believe, one opportunity for us to get in as a freestanding team or freestanding members, and it is extremely difficult. So there isn't a place for adult members to fit into the adult program, the competitive program. And I think that, as we had mentioned, is definitely a part of what excludes diversity and inclusion, but also generationally ruins the opportunity for people of all skill sets and ages to have acceptance.
So what can we do to take small steps initially at sort of an individual level to try to make the sport more inclusive? I go to the curling club on Monday night, I play my game. I don't think I'm being racist and excluding people in doing that, but I also want the sport to be more inclusive. I want to have a space where everybody can feel welcome and just enjoy the sport, because I love the sport, and I think the more other people participate, they'll enjoy it as well. So what can we do on an individual basis, do you think, to make the sport more inclusive and to make it a welcoming place? Scott, I see you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've got a bus that goes outside my house, so it's really loud. That's why I've been muted this whole time. But with Sean, we talked last year. We did an episode on the gay nationals here. Yeah. It's Pride Month now. We've seen a lot of leagues open across Canada that are rainbow leagues or gay leagues, and it's helped a lot the inclusion of that community into the other leagues at the club. So I'm wondering if our guests think that having a league night tailored to a specific community, or having maybe an intro to curling targeted through maybe a cultural center that's located somewhere, or another community group, and say, hey, you're all invited to come try curling. And I wonder if that is one of the first steps we can take, but I also don't know how effective it would be. So I'd like to ask our guests that, if they think that would be effective.
I think when it comes to doing a specific night that's tailored to, I think one of the challenges that we feel is having the attention focused on us. So when I think of that, for like, if we were to have a night that was like, African American night, or something like that, it may feel like, oh, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of eyes on me, and you still have that discomfort. I really like the idea, though, of having introductions to curling at places like recreational centers, like you had made a reference to, because I think that bringing curling to some of those communities, diverse communities, will make it more accessible to them, and it will generate their interest to maybe seek outwards. Porsche and I were actually just talking about that.
Yeah.
So you have some thoughts on that. We
were mentioning earlier, here in the States, it's not that there aren't curling clubs in areas that serve these communities. There are, as Jason had mentioned, especially in Toronto, there is a very diverse population in Toronto, as there are very diverse populations around the arena curling clubs and even some of the dedicated facilities that we have. I think immediately of Chicago and Pittsburgh, where you go to those clubs and there aren't any people that look like us. There are no minorities really that curl there for the most part. And that's not because they're not in areas where those communities are full of minorities that may want to curl. It's the outreach. And so, Scott, you did bring up a great point. Maybe finding a way to partner with community centers or recreation centers and areas where curling already exists, but they have never had a thought or an introduction. Maybe they don't even know that the shared arena with the figure skaters and the hockey players does curling on Saturdays or Sundays. Having a flyer or a billboard there, having someone that will come in during a time where children are doing recreational hour just to speak about curling or do a small demo. We have a lot of floor curling. There are a lot of different games, shuffleboards and things that I've seen where at the clubs we gain great interest for new curlers that have never seen the sport. And if those things were brought to those communities at a recreational or community center level, as well as I believe we talked about with some of the schools, college levels, like Jason had mentioned, the UT program, but also elementary schools and high schools. There are a lot of high school students, I'm sure, that would love to spend time on the ice that don't know that this program exists.
Yeah, and we're those from California. We were surrounded by curling clubs. We had no idea that any of them existed. And we were surprised to go inside and see that there were so many people packed. You know, the Learn to Curls were packed, sold out, some of them. We're like, wow, this has been going on for years. We had no idea.
Yeah, part of the problem with going to a club and feeling different is that like, because you feel different, you sort of are loath to go back. Maybe you feel uncomfortable. You think, well, this isn't for me. But if you have a league with more people who look the same, who have a common cultural touchstones, who can talk about things after and feel like they're part of the same community, then the curling club becomes a more inclusive space for those people, I would hope. And they would feel more interested in going back. And like I say, I think we've done a pretty good job with the rainbow leagues across Canada, anyway, in making that community feel more accepted in curling. And I think it's maybe something we could look at doing for other communities as well.
Yeah,
Scott,
I wonder because. Sorry, go ahead, Jason.
So certainly, I think Scott is right in terms of the rainbow leagues, the LGBTQ leagues. I curled at the Royal Canadian Curling Club here in Toronto for a couple seasons on a different mixed team, and they have one of the larger programs for that community. And you see them, and I was in the mixed league, the regular evening mixed league, and you see a lot of those curlers in the rainbow leagues joining the other leagues too, right? So, and for the Royal Canadian Curling Club, it's a source of pride that they have this inclusion of this community into their club. I haven't seen other leagues like that for specific cultural communities or racial communities. Whether that will work or not, maybe it works. I think one of the bigger challenges, though, for at least really urban curling clubs, certainly in Toronto, is the lack of actual ice time to give up. At my club, at East York, at Leaside, at the Royals, at Hyde Park, at Oakville, you wouldn't be able to squeeze out. It's very hard to squeeze out another 2-hour block for a new league at a good time slot, right?
Right.
And so that is, I think, one of the bigger challenges is to doing that, at least in curling clubs in like an urban center like Toronto.
Wait, you don't want the Sunday morning at 6 slot?
That's what we could offer. Yes, the Sunday morning at 6 a.m. Actually, at East York Curling Club, we might not even be able to offer that because at East York, we're actually a city-owned facility. So it would be whether the city will be willing to open the club at 6 o'clock in the morning to accommodate that and what the collective bargaining agreement is with the ice makers.
Well, I was thinking too today that, in terms of getting different communities interested, the representation at the highest level can be part of that. And I was thinking CBC on Hockey Night in Canada, they have the Punjabi broadcast. So it's a Punjabi play-by-play. I think it's a team. I think there's two of them who do it. So could TSN, instead of showing the games on TSN 1, 3, 4, and 5, maybe one of those TSNs could have a Punjabi language play-by-play of the curling broadcast, and maybe that type of initiative can help generate more interest in communities that traditionally don't really get involved in curling, and that sort of thing is a small step that TSN potentially could take in reaching out to different communities. Certainly, I know in the United States, linguistically, it might not be the same, but maybe NBC Sports on Curling Night in America, maybe they could do a Spanish language version of the show, right, to reach out to different communities.
Absolutely.
I think that.
Yeah, that was actually something that I was thinking about too, Sean, was whether, just like your example, the Punjabi version of Hockey Night in Canada, whether that's possible. And I guess for a network, it's always going to be down to the dollars and cents, right? Whether there's going to be viewership for that. But, one possibility I could see is, a TSN promoting the hell out of, a World Championship China versus Canada game and doing that specific broadcast in the two languages, right? In an English version and French version and a Chinese version, right? Or the game against Japan, there's a Japanese broadcast for that, or audio for that one. Or maybe it's just even borrowing or buying the broadcast that NHK is doing out of Japan for the Japanese feed instead, right? Does TSN even have to have their own commentators for it? Can we just buy the feed from the other broadcaster to broadcast it in a different language?
Right. Or just trade it, right? The NHK can have the TSN broadcast for any English-speaking expats in Japan, and then TSN can do the NHK one for Japanese-speaking Canadians. Like that seems like a win-win.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sounds like a great
Sorry,
idea.
Yeah. Sorry, Aria, did you want to say something? I felt like I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to piggyback and say there's tons of opportunities for partnerships. And so I think you guys are talking about a couple of them. I think there are plenty of them out there.
I'm curious to know too, what do we think the biggest roadblock is in terms that this is a huge question, I realize, but biggest roadblock in terms of diversifying the sports at the club level? You've each talked about your own personal experiences, but what is it that is the biggest impediment for clubs welcoming in people, being a space of inclusivity, and having a more representative population in the club as to the communities in which these clubs exist?
I would say, just to start off, being at the events or in areas that the communities you're targeting frequent or show up to. For instance, with Wine Country, we'll go or we'll host a lot of events that are more up north towards, I believe it's Pollock Pines on the way towards North Tahoe. We'll do festivals and fairs and different things that are still specific to a demographic that lives or frequents in that area. But if you're looking to diversify, as we had mentioned, maybe showing up to different community events that are in areas that are not necessarily close to the club or do not serve the current members. So that way you're putting curling in the face of people that have not seen it before. I think that's an immediate win for all clubs. Make friends with people that don't look like you.
You have to want to make the effort.
Right. I agree.
Jason,
I think that's what you need to do, right? Is to intentionally go to the groups that have been underrepresented in our sport. But the impediment is actually the membership base currently itself, right? They don't think about doing that necessarily. And a lot of curling club boards of directors are representative of that one community, slightly older, white, established Canadians. And so they don't think about that necessarily at their board level as a high priority. So I think one thing to do for all clubs is to think more about whether, their mixed league or their league committees, as well as their board, is to get more diversity onto their league committees and their board, because that will give you more perspectives, new ideas, and better be able to outreach different communities.
I guess one of the things I wonder about, though, is the resources that are available to do that. Certainly, clubs in this country, urban clubs, well, I can only speak for the Ottawa situation. the Ottawa Curling Club, for instance, is full most nights. So there's no real push for that, financially push to go get new members, regardless of what they look like, because the club is full and it makes money, and sort of who cares, I guess. And then rural clubs or smaller clubs, mostly volunteer based, may not have the time or the money to go and engage in that outreach. And maybe the same as in the US, certainly arena clubs seem to run on shoestring budgets, mostly with volunteers. So I am curious, I recognize that it is really important to do outreach and to go and get interest or try to generate interest in communities. But I do wonder, is there that element of it that so much of the sport is based on a volunteer basis and there's not a lot of financial resources to do that? And is that something that national governing bodies or provincial bodies in this country should be responsible for in providing funding for that type of outreach, as opposed to leaving it to individuals who might already be maxed out in terms of their time commitment or financial commitment?
Well, I certainly think that it is one of the responsibilities. There are, of course, lots of stakeholders, and I think everybody has their own individual responsibility to increase our diversity and inclusion in the sport, right? From the individual member to the leagues, to the individual curling club and facility, as well as to the local associations like the Toronto Curling Association, to the provincial body like the Curl On here in Ontario, and of course the Curling Canada on a national level. Certainly, we have seen some initiatives from the Curling Canada to do this, right? One is, of course, through the Rocks and Rings program. That is one outreach mechanism to younger people, but also to a more diverse audience. But of course, the payoff for a Rocks and Rings program into someone actually curling, I don't know if there's ever any statistics on how many of those kids end up going into curling. And maybe they don't go into curling now, but they're going into curling later, and we don't have the data to necessarily back that up. We've certainly seen Curling Canada put out much more diverse advertising, right, to get people interested in curling. I think it kind of maybe started with the Johnny the Hammer Chow commercial, but it's now progressed to even more diversity than that in the recent years. So certainly there's a role to play from the national bodies, and maybe even more so from a body that is more local, like the Toronto Curling Association, or I don't know if Ottawa Valley has a curling association as well. I think you guys do. And I think the Hamilton area has one as well. But for some of the smaller communities and the more rural communities, they actually don't usually have that sort of like a local or regional body for that sport. And you're right, you're depending a lot on the volunteers. And how do you expect the volunteers to do all that legwork?
And what's the situation for you in California? And I'm curious too, if there's been situations as part of your career where you've been imposed upon as the two Black women who curl, that people view it as almost now it's your job. You go recruit a more diverse audience. Have you had situations where that has been put on you because of who you are?
I think slightly. There is an expectation that we're to bring more people into the community, or that we're kind of the poster children for diversity when it comes to advertising or marketing, interviews, things like that. But I noticed that Jason had mentioned, with Curling Canada or Curl On for Ontario, there's a lot of diversity in marketing. Here we don't see as much diversity with our marketing. So I think that is an immediate step that absolutely the national body here for USA Curling could take a step to change. We have monthly newsletters, monthly newspapers that come out advertising about equipment, obviously, and none of that marketing is inclusive with minority groups. And that is not necessarily just people of color, but just minorities in general. We don't see any minority advertising. So that is an immediate change, I think, that could happen here that will absolutely make a difference or spark interest. If you see a newspaper with people who look the exact opposite of you, then you're maybe not as encouraged to read it as you would if there were a diverse mix of people as you're scrolling through the pages. So I noticed that is something that's really large for clubs out here. We have I think bodies that are by region, the MOPAC Association and different regions, I think that also could be more accountable, not necessarily just from an advertising level, but the outreach and the funding that we had talked about for the rural clubs or volunteers, et cetera. From a regional perspective, I know that the funding and the resources there could be allocated to acceptance and diversity or inclusion.
And how do we, I'm curious too, to make sure that, the discussion doesn't, I used the word tokenism earlier, that it, that these sorts of things aren't tokeny. And I'll use the example, just how I personally feel about rainbow things, that, I'm glad that we're being, that people like me can feel included and can feel welcomed and all that stuff. But I don't need to see another rainbow donut, for instance, right? In June, right? That sort of stuff feels really tokeny to me and doesn't really make me feel good at all, for as much as I think it makes the company feel good about what the company is doing. So, at what point do we, or how do we ensure that it doesn't cross that line into tokenism and make sure that these are genuine attempts to be welcoming and to truly diversify the space?
Well, I'll just say that, at least in our experience, being genuine means having that acceptance more so than the initial meet. When you meet someone or you meet a person of color, maybe you see someone different in your club that doesn't look like you. That doesn't necessarily mean welcoming them there, but how do you respond and how do you interact with those groups as they continue to frequent the club that you're at? It's more than being welcome and saying you have a place here. It's also about how you treat and retain the members that come in and visit the spaces that you're in. So one thing that can be taken away, I'm sure, as you know, with Pride Month and all of the things that we get to experience and see as tokens of what sexuality is, really being genuine is just, I mean, being a good friend and being a good teammate.
It's also making people feel as if they're equal to you just naturally as you're talking to them. So if you do have some sort of recruiting effort to the Asian community, it's not, when they're finally coming into the curling club, it's like, okay, all right, everybody who's Asian, hey, nice to meet all of you. I'm so happy that you guys are curling. It can't feel like that. It has to feel as if that Asian person is no different than that black person person is no different than that Mexican person is no different than that white person, and so on.
We all
have to
stack
feel the same.
Right.
If you put so much attention on one specific group, then we never have a chance to feel normal.
Jason, did you want to say anything on that topic?
No, I think they pretty much summed up what I was going to say. It's not just about diversity, right? It's about the inclusion piece too. It's not about just inviting someone to the party, but asking them to dance, right? So I think that's what's important. Everybody should think about that when we are looking at this outreach to different communities for curling, is making sure that they are not just, you get the diversity, but you have them included and they've been asked to dance.
Scott, is there any questions from anybody who's watching by chance?
I've not seen any questions coming in.
Okay.
I think we've covered a lot of things about what we can do as curlers to welcome people into the club. I'm wondering where we want to go from there. Sean, I know you've guided a lot of discussions before, so I'll leave it to you. But are we feeling good right now?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of have a final, if there's nothing from the Facebook audience. Yeah, I was just going to sort of a final question is, what do you think the next steps are? It's great that these discussions are happening. It's certainly not just our show. Rocks Across the Pond has done an episode discussing diversity, not just in curling, but in general, and anti-racism. These discussions are taking place across the world, really, at this moment. It's great that that's happening in this moment. Obviously, the circumstances surrounding it are not great, but that there is a discussion going on. But what steps can we all take in our lives to make sure that this doesn't fizzle out at the end of the month or at the end of the week, or that this is an ongoing thing, that we're committed to anti-racism and dismantling the systemic racism that exists in our communities and in our societies. And not just within the curling club, but in our daily lives. And obviously, Scott, people who look like us, one thing is to call it out when we see it. And that's, I think, an important step that we can do. But for our guest, I'm curious as to what you think the next steps are and how we can continue this dialogue to further the discussion and ultimately work to dismantle the structural issues that contribute to systemic racism in our respective countries.
I think something that immediately jumps to mind is what Porsche has said about making friends with someone that doesn't look like you, and how Jason said, if you're going to invite us to the party, ask us to dance. I think that we have to have more of these conversations. I think we need to have more honest conversations and not be so afraid of the response that we're going to get from either party. It's time to get uncomfortable and have these uncomfortable discussions. That way we know how to move on. I was really happy to see that you guys spearheaded having this conversation. This alone, huge kudos to you guys, because these aren't the initiatives that we're seeing in the US from curling. So it's really happy to see, I'm really happy to see that you guys are taking that initiative. I think we need to see others that do the same thing. I think curling clubs need to look inside and say, well, one, do we really want diversity? And two, because that's an honest question. You may not want diversity in your club. That's okay. So it's just being honest with yourself. And one, do you really want to have diversity? And two, what has been holding us back from not having diversity at that club? And really take a chance, take a moment to look within, so that way we can all have honest conversations and move forward.
Absolutely. Systemically, I think that it really is, it starts at home. And rather than noting and calling out these differences, celebrating them, just because we're different and we operate differently on and off the ice, there are certain things to be said about how I function versus how Auria functions versus Jason, Sean, Scott. So all of those things that make us extremely different, though they're great call outs, there's still great things to celebrate, I think, about people individually, and to learn to accept those differences where they don't feel so awkward and uncomfortable, but they can be acknowledged in a place that is friendly and accepting.
Yeah, I'll just tell a quick story. I spent a year during my undergrad in Barbados, and there was a couple classes that I was in where I was the only white person in the class. And I had this one professor, I had him the whole time I was there, and it was towards the end, and he started a discussion about affirmative action, and that was the subject of the lecture. And he started the lecture by saying, we should all know what affirmative action is because we're all Black. And then he looked over at me and he said, except for you. And I would tell that story to my friends, all of whom were Black, who I was living with in Barbados, and they would all laugh. They thought that was a hilarious story. And I came home and I would tell my friends in North Bay, who were, I think, all white, that story, and they would clam up and get super uncomfortable with it. And I think it's just that's the sort of thing that, let's explore why that story would make you uncomfortable. And address it. And, as you were talking about, Porsche, the difference is, let's celebrate them. Let's acknowledge them first, that there are differences, and let's celebrate what they are. And also then celebrate the collectivity of it, and how we are all human and who we all feel, and really just allow for that. Jason, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Well, what I want to say was, what better sport than curling to try to bring different groups of people together. And the reason I say that is the whole notion of broom stacking after a game. It's not just you get to play against your opponents, and hopefully more diverse opponents over time, but you also get to know them afterwards when you have your drink. And so I just think curling has this great potential, one of the unique sports that have this great potential to actually bring those different communities together, right? It's not a sport where you play against the opponents and then you leave, right? So I think curling has great potential. I just wanted to just go back to something that you said, Sean, in terms of curling clubs, and at the Ottawa Club or at many urban curling clubs, it is already packed, right? Is there really an incentive for those clubs to be trying to get more members because they can't actually accommodate that many more members? And maybe it's not right now, but I think sport and any sorts of sports, there's going to be ebbs and flows in terms of popularity. And what I've seen in another sport, which used to be packed, the golf and country clubs in Toronto used to be packed, that you couldn't get a membership into St. George's or Weston or Scarborough. You would, the memberships cost tens of $1,000s, and there were these long waiting lists. I heard that you basically have to wait for someone to die, and then you pretty much have to know someone at the club to recommend you to get you in. Now those golf clubs don't have that long. They're dying for people to come in and buy memberships, right? So they rested on their success, or maybe the false notion that they have these long memberships, thinking that will just continue forever. And I think for any business, and a curling club is a business, you have to think about a longer time frame than just that.
Yeah, that's a great point. We do need to be more forward thinking, and across the board. Yeah, even if an individual club is currently full, you're right, it's not going to be that way forever. And numbers are down in this country in general. So, and that we're losing clubs is something that is almost unfathomable when you think of curling in this country. Even in places like Saskatchewan, a couple clubs have closed in Regina. And, if a club can close in Regina, then, that's sort of the canary in the coal mine almost, to think about the future of the sport. And certainly diversity and diversifying the sport just leads to not only I think a more welcoming and inclusive community of curlers, but just the health of the sport is improved. And certainly I think it's growing in certain parts of the world, but in Canada, yeah, we need to be more proactive and just make it a more inclusive place. So, Scott, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I agree.
All right, great contribution, Scott.
Thanks, Ed.
Solid job. So I just want to take a moment and thank our guests, Porsche Stephenson, Auria Moore, all the way from California, Jason Chang from Toronto. Thank you so much for taking the time today to join us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Sean and Scott. Thanks so much, Auria and Porsche. Great meeting you, and I wish you guys well in your future curling endeavors. And what I take away from this, and it links back to how you started the conversation, Sean, is I hope that one day when Vic does his final essay monologue, that we see that diversity that we're talking about today in his monologue.
And there you have it, our discussion with Porsche Stephenson, Auria Moore, and Jason Chang, and our thanks to the three of them for joining us today for that discussion. And Scott, as we said, the discussion does not end there. This is something that needs to be taken to curling clubs. Anybody who's listening to this, this is discussion that you can have at your clubs, in your life, to ensure that we are fostering an environment and a culture within the sport that is inclusive and is open, because we love the sport, right? And if you're listening to this, you probably love curling, and we want to make it so that everyone feels welcome and it's an open space, and that not only just because that's the right thing to do, but as Jason talked about, it's part of the future of the sport, ensuring that the sport can grow and is strong. And part of that is really honestly, openly talking about these issues that were raised in the discussion.
Yeah, I don't think that we're doing enough right now, and I'd like to one day not know off the top of my head who the only visible minorities are who've won the Brier. I would like that them to just be part of a long list. We've seen the Curling Canada commercials, with the kids that show a variety of different backgrounds for those children. It's a good start, but like you said, and like Jason said, if we're seeing curling clubs closing, there is definitely a market of people that have not been catered to up to this point.
Yep.
And if we want the sport to stay strong, and if we want Canada to continue to produce the best curling teams in the world, we need those communities to feel welcome and to just be a part of our sport.
Yes, and it starts with each of us. So you know, we encourage you to keep reading, keep going out, finding more resources, and just think about the things. Start with yourself that you can do in your life to create more open, welcome, inclusive environments. So that'll do it for this week's episode. Thank you everybody for listening and engaging in this. And this is not the last time that we're going to do something like this. We're going to continue with it. It's going to be part of the show as we continue, not only through the summer, but on the assumption that curling starts again and the Grand Slams start and the events that we talk about so much start. We're going to keep doing it. And as Ryan said at the end of their episode this week, and I would encourage everybody to go listen to that Rocks Across the Pond episode that was released last week, where they talked about diversity. As he said on theirs, I will echo it here. If you're listening to this episode in July 2021 or even later or whenever, and you look back at the shows that we've done since then and the issue has not been raised again, call us out for it. Send us an email, hit us up on Twitter. Really, we're committed to continuing this discussion, and please don't let us fall off that. Keep us committed to it, and make sure that if we start to slip, that call us out for it. We encourage that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So to do that, you can find us Game of Stones podcast at gmail.com. On Twitter, it's at Game of Stones Pod. Same on Instagram. The Facebook page, if you want to find video of this, this is the first time we've done this, but we did this as a video episode on Facebook and we streamed it live. And that video is still there on our Facebook page, which is Game of Stones Podcast on Facebook. So you can find video there if you want to go back and watch the episode rather than listen to it. So that's there as well. And you can find all other sorts of stuff over on the Facebook page. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with you next week with another episode. But until then, keep your brooms on the ice and don't dump that intern.
Make the final.